All right. Hello, Michael. Thank you for coming. And could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah. Hey, Sarah. My name is Michael O'Rourke, and in a previous life, I used to be an iOS engineer and Solidity developer, and leading to that, I'm one of the co-founders of Pocket and Grove, which is one of the primary gateways on top of the network.
So, what does Pocket do right now?
Yeah, today, Pocket incentivizes people to run full nodes for any blockchain. This is colloquially known in the space as RPC, although in reality, RPC is really much more broad than just a blockchain RPC. But fundamentally, when you open up your crypto wallet, like a Trust wallet or something like that, and you see the little loading screen and you see you have 5 ETH in your wallet, that data comes from services like Pocket, where the developer of that wallet or the builder of that wallet uses our APIs, which then connects to the network of 60 plus blockchains to support for infrastructure.
So, from a technical perspective, Pocket incentivizes people to run nodes for different blockchains. Those nodes are accessible for companies and applications to query for specific data on that blockchain. Am I understanding that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay. And you've been involved with Pocket, which is the actual protocol itself, and also Grove, which is a company that... How would you frame what Grove does?
Yeah, Grove is the primary gateway on top of the network. We've spent the last 2 years proving that you can build out a business fully trusting a Web3 protocol like Pocket. Recently, Grove has evolved into not actually building a gateway, but the tooling for gateways. So moving forward, Grove is just focusing on tooling to enable others to build a gateway. And what I mean by that is there's probably somewhere between 100 and 200 RPC providers in the market today. And every single one of them has reinvented the wheel in terms of the data, the architecture, the infrastructure, all of it. And what Path is, which is the product that Grove is taking from what its learnings of the last 2 years, is to enable anyone to build their own gateway very quickly without having to reinvent the wheel. So I would like to 10x the amount of gateways that we have in the market today.
And to be clear, as of now, there's more than one gateway using Pocket as its protocol, right?
Yes, until relatively recently, Grove has been the only one, and now we have about 6 gateways operating on the network today. The downside of the current structure, though, is that it's permissioned. And Pocket was designed to be permissionless on the demand and supply side. We've been permissionless on the supply side. Anyone can run a node. But until we launched the new version of Pocket, which is named Shannon, for Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, at that point, it'll be completely permissionless for anyone to operate their own app or gateway on top of the network.
So what do the economics look like for a gateway? So they have to spend a certain amount and they earn a certain amount per query. They set the prices for themselves. Could you go into a bit of detail around how that's structured?
Yeah, let me start with kind of a traditional centralized gateway first, and that'll help give insight into kind of the architecture of Pocket and how it works. So if I'm a centralized gateway, I'll build a UI. I'll have an API and a backend that plugs into that UI. I'll have a database that tracks some amount of data for the queries that are being sent. So, usually developers want to know, how fast I'm getting those requests, whether something was an error, what that error code was. A lot of that requires, for example, database to be able to provide to your users as a gateway. And then below all of that, you're running all of the blockchain nodes that you decide to support, right? Some support 8, some support 20, some support 50, right? And that entire stack is what a centralized gateway usually does. And then they have their operational costs for overhead for the infrastructure. They've got however many employees that they have working on it. These are usually pretty big teams. Like the biggest gateways in Web3 have well over 100 people working at these companies. That's like Alchemy, Infura, QuickNode, these sorts of companies. And on top of that, the infrastructure is also very expensive because in most cases, they're running on the cloud as well. Comparing that to a Pocket network gateway, you basically have just the database, the backend, and the UI. So a much smaller team can now work on serving their customers and frankly be able to build more features and more use cases that more better serve their whatever use case they're looking to build for or to help build. And they just plug into the Pocket network. And the nice part about plugging into Pocket is that you have access to all of the blockchains that are supported by the network right off the bat. So if another gateway decides to spin up, I don't know, what's a new one coming out? Clayton or Solana or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? Well, at that point, now I have access to be able to provide access to that service for other developers in Solana.
And these gateways, they make a profit, which is the difference between the cost that they're doing to run and also to pay back to the Pocket network and whatever they're charging their customers, and that's their margin there. And you say now there are 6, is that right?
Yes, yeah. So we have 6 gateways. Off the top of my head, we've got Liquify, Nodis, Chainstack, Porters, and Developer DAO as well as Groves, of course. And we've got several others in the pipeline right now that are looking forward to building on Pocket, but we have hard limits on the actual current version of the protocol to be able to onboard them. On the costs and the actual business itself, you have your infrastructure costs, which generally the most expensive part of that are running the nodes. So that's completely cut out. But in lieu of paying the infrastructure costs for the nodes, gateways have to pay a fee in the form of a burn to the network. And instead of having a massive team running this massive infrastructure stack, you now can just pay a nominal burn for the traffic that you're sending through the network. And basically the company's margin is what they charge above, their salaries and the actual infrastructure costs themselves.
So this is putting the business of running a gateway into more people's hands by taking off like a massive piece of the puzzle, which is the running the nodes. It's a lot of data. I think I read somewhere that Ethereum has grown by 2 terabytes of data per week, and obviously this changes. Some of it gets archived. It's really hard to store that much data and for a team to manage that kind of work. What was the idea behind this? What drove you to... How did you see this as an opportunity? Did it start as something else and then grow? Could you tell me a bit about the history?
Yeah. Where to start? Yes, I got into Bitcoin in 2013. I'm from the Caribbean originally, in Dominican Republic, and moved to the U.S. in Florida when I was about 2 years old. And I've used Western Union a ton of times to send money to my family because most of my family still lives there in Santo Domingo. And I also worked at 2 credit unions in 2011 and 2012, selling loans like credit card loans, car loans, and that sort of thing. And I saw thousands of credit reports, and part of that process made me see kind of how fucked up the financial system is for so many people. And that led me in 2013, read an article about Bitcoin, ended up on the subreddit, immediately drank the Kool-Aid. I was just like, this is so important for humanity, to be completely honest. And that's what really kind of got me into the space, because I'm as a millennial, I'm 35. I've always had a general distrust of our institutions, and from being 18 from the financial crisis, the way COVID was managed globally, and just everything in between. It's just I always had to figure it out myself, and it just always felt like there's just much more potential and opportunity for not just myself but for people. And Bitcoin seemed the first alternative to actually a better path for people and the world that was really meaningful to me. And so dove into the space pretty deeply. I was an iOS engineer at the time, was just buying Bitcoin and reading on the forums and the subreddit and everything. And over the years, I had been reading threads on the Bitcoin Talk forums, and eventually when I got into Ethereum in 2016 on the ETH Research forums about this idea of incentivizing nodes. I didn't find it super important at the time, but the moment that I actually found it, I actually felt it being really critical was when I started to get into Solidity development. I used another service called Infura, which they are critical to Ethereum, in my opinion, or were critical to Ethereum. They made developers' lives much easier back in 2015, 2016 to actually build on top of Ethereum, and were the backbone of every major app, ICO, so on and so forth. And I think they were just really critical. But they were also driving, upwards of 95% of all the Ethereum traffic. And given that, you have to run a node and have control of this open source data to be able to serve that information to the end users, I think over time it became increasingly important. That part of the stack became increasingly important for me, and it just was evident to me that it was a really big problem if we were going to kind of replicate, the last 20 years in tech, where we've got, just a couple big companies driving all of the data that's being sent. In addition, this was back in 2016, 2017, but even then the amount of data being passed around the world was exponentially increasing, and even more so today. If you look at the graph of just, the amount of, I think it's zettabytes of data being passed on a daily basis with all our devices and everything is enormous. And a fraction of that is open source data. And that's only going to grow. The trend has been for people, whether you're a CSO, CIO in a major corporation, or just people building on open source is growing over time. And it just felt like a really important problem that we could solve that could really, frankly, change the world.
Yeah. One of the most common things I hear from people, especially in the Bitcoin world, is running your own node, taking responsibility of the data. But I don't think the average listener, even the average developer, understands what it means to store 2 terabytes of data a day for a single network when there's hundreds of them, and what that means for how do you manage that. The physical infrastructure isn't really there. Most people, my computer has 2 terabytes of data, but I paid hundreds of dollars for that, and obviously you can get external hard drives, but how many of those are you going to rack up? How do you make sure that they stay readable and they don't break? And we end up at this next layer, which is the cloud. A lot of people are storing data on the cloud. A question that comes up from here technically is, does the current Pocket stack need to be on a specific cloud, or can it be put on any cloud?
Yeah, it can be put on any cloud. Just to touch on your point with people running nodes, I used to run nodes, but the fact is that 99.9% of people aren't going to want to run their own blockchain node. They're large, like you mentioned. It requires a lot of storage. They're not going to fit in your phone. Although light clients have been a thing for a while, we still haven't really seen the manifestation of or proliferation of wide adoption of light clients. And ultimately, people are going to use what's easiest. And that's kind of why we actually named Pocket, because it's like accessing a full node in your pocket, but you'll be able to trust the data that you're receiving without having to trust anyone else, basically, right? So that was an important piece for us.
I think Monero, to a certain degree, has worked on this problem and improved it. Running your own Monero client, you have to run a portion at least of the chain, and everybody has to do that to have any kind of wallet. Yeah. I don't see the same thing happening in Ethereum, maybe because there's just so much more data being transferred and moved around. What are some of the challenges that you've ran into over the last few years, specifically on the technical side for now?
Yeah, real quick, I didn't touch on the cloud question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you can run a Pocket node and an Ethereum node anywhere you want. A cool anecdote for us was when we first launched, almost 100% of the nodes were actually being ran on the cloud. And over time, economics dictated that people actually find ways to save costs and save on costs. And now today, 100% of our nodes are either run by owned infrastructure or on bare metal, which I think is pretty cool. But ultimately, yeah, you can run a node anywhere. To talk about challenges, Do you want to sit here for 5 hours? Well, at least we can talk. Let's start technically, right? The original vision of Pocket, and which it still is today, is to allow anyone to plug in and run a node, and anyone to be able to plug in an app and stake Poct and use that Poct in the form of a burn to pay for your RPC traffic, which the nodes then mint, right? We forked Pocket early on from Tendermint. We actually didn't, and this was one of the first challenges we came across. Pocket's a very unique type of protocol, and at the time, the Cosmos SDK wasn't sufficient for what we needed. So, and even the default consensus wasn't sufficient for what we needed. So we went ahead and forked Tendermint and actually built our own ABCI app from scratch. Now it's known as Comet BFT, but this was interesting. So just to give you a concrete example, something that we came across was the default in Tendermint is a round robin consensus algorithm. We changed that to pseudo-random, for example. So each one of the validators are pseudo-randomly selected rather than knowing who was going to get chosen. And this was important for DDoS attacks, given that everyone is running also a blockchain node that is connected to the open internet, despite maybe some restrictions. It felt important to avoid risks, for example, to pseudo-randomly select validators rather than let people be able to compute ahead of time who's going to be serving that information. We also had challenges right off the bat with just the scaling of the protocol. We really didn't know how it would react, and there was very little tooling to be able to diagnose things that were happening at the time. I mean, this was very early Cosmos and Tendermint, in 2019, 2020, and this kind of time frame. And we had several chain halts that first year. There's one phase we had one of our first users at the time take us from 2 million requests a day to 12 million. And that broke the network. We call that the dark blocks days. I think if I recall, it's around like blocks like 2,500 to 3,500 in the network's history. But you'll notice that if you're syncing a Pocket node, it's a little bit slower. That's because we were seeing relays get propagated to everyone in a exponential manner and ultimately taking down the network. So we had several random things like that happen, like little edge cases, because there wasn't really any architecture or structure similar to what to what had been built previously. Other challenges. I mean, there's so many. I mean, having to deal with the token and understanding a community. I believe tokens are really critical for coordination and incentives. Ultimately, that's why I actually believe in Web3 and cryptocurrencies more broadly, is because it's really the first human coordination technology that is internet native. And that's a really special and powerful thing. But it does come with trade-offs and different types of challenges, but opportunities as well, right? So, talking about the Web3 market, listed, thinking about liquidity when you've got a community of people that believe in you and have purchased the token, so on and so forth. And that just requires an entirely different skill set from building iPhone apps like I was before. So that's been challenging to work through. I'd say more recently, getting the last version the latest version of Pocket built. We've been in a 0 point, basically a beta, honestly, up until today. We don't have a Pocket 1.0. Pocket 1.0 is actually going to be launching in about 6 months, but it's taken us, I think we finalized the initial white paper for the 1.0 version of Pocket in January of 22, right? And now almost 3 years later is when it's launching. And that's because when we first launched Pocket, we assumed that apps would be permissionless, but we found out very quickly, and this is another reason we had a chain halt, was you had too many apps staked on the network that loaded up the blocks with too much data, and it caused the nodes that are the nodes that are selected to be the validators at that moment in time, even with 15-minute block times, have to take more time than needed to actually get all of the compute. So we've had to limit the amount of apps and gateways on the network, even till today. And one of the things that I'm most excited about is that Shannon is actually the manifestation of the original vision that we had, which is a permissionless market of gateways, applications on one side, and nodes on the other. And that's just been so difficult to get, even clear, because, we've been, I think, consistently 6 to 12 months ahead of the curve. So much so that there's always been very little tooling to build what we need to do. At the time when we first, architected and designed Pocket, it was really just Tendermint and Polkadot at the time. Those were the only two options, or roll your own blockchain. And we didn't have the funding to be able to do that. So after kind of an analysis just from first principles, we ended up going with Tendermint. And, once we designed the new version of Pocket, there wasn't any rollups. There was no Celestia. Arbitrum wasn't live. Optimism wasn't live. Cosmos wasn't cutting it for us. So we actually designed Pocket as its own independent blockchain. So for about a year and a half, we started building Pocket as its own independent blockchain because nothing was able to meet what we needed at the time. And like I said, rolling your own blockchain is incredibly difficult because there's kind of 4 stacks to it. There's a consensus layer, right, which we forked hot stuff. So one of the key things that we'd like to do is not reinvent the wheel. That was cool because it's still there in our repo, but I'd like that we were able to call it Hot Pocket. We had some cool branding for that. But you have the consensus layer, you've got the persistence layer, so like the database, that whole thing. You've got the peer-to-peer layer, which is like the networking. And then you've got the app layer, which is like what makes the blockchain a blockchain, right? Or in terms of the utility, right? It could be smart contracts. In our case, it's not, right? It's the interface that allows people to stake nodes, to send traffic, some of the governance stuff, that whole thing, right? And doing all of that from scratch takes time and is a huge challenge. Credit for our now CTO, Olshansky, for really being honest with himself and the space and always constantly questioning, are we doing the right thing? Because, DevCon, I believe in Bogota, as early as that, which was in 22, I think, in 2022, November 22, we were already thinking should we be building our own blockchain? And there was very little out at the time. I think our Optimism had just launched, but there was no Bedrock, for example, which Bedrock is a really cool tool for Optimism. And we were like, no, now's not the right time. And then we saw Coinbase build their thing. We saw others switch, and we just kept reevaluating until about September, October last year, where we're just like, okay, it looks like there's something real here. Let's pause development of building our own blockchain from scratch, and let's see if there's something that we can use that can just make it easier and quicker for us. And ultimately, we decided back to Comet BFT, which is Cosmos, but originally we were going with Rollkit, but either way, it doesn't matter. The important part is that now we don't have to build the consensus, the persistence, nor the peer-to-peer layer. The entire protocol team can just focus on the application layer, which accelerates everything. So when we talk about challenges, it's just even our space. It moves so fucking fast. And, what was relevant 3 years ago is absolutely no longer relevant. And it's really important to have to be circumspect and self-critical to understand, are you doing the right thing in this moment in time, and be able to move, to be able to capitalize on the right set of tools that you need to have the outcome that you're looking for.
There's a lot of self-reevaluation, and I do want to shift it back to the more social and personal kind of struggles. I think one of the issues that is personal to me is I feel like our space is very aggressive, and the people are on a much, much more gray moral scale. The businesses are a lot more there isn't much in terms of regulation and in terms of how things are set up. There's no punishment. There's a lot of reward and rugging people. There's a lot of bad incentives, I believe. And having a company survive 5 years in tech and then 5 years in crypto, like these are two big challenges. I don't think there's, besides the few like Uniswap and maybe what you said with Infura, there aren't many companies that are still around now, and they were around 5 years ago. Or they started 5 years ago. How have you dealt with the personal struggles of working in this space? And what was the evolution of that like? So from the start in 2019 until now in 2024?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I really didn't know what I was getting myself into, if I'm completely honest. We were pretty, still am pretty mission driven. We just wanted to build something that made an impact. Ultimately, it grew faster and made more of an impact than and more quickly than whatever we could have guessed. But the way that I like to kind of tell the team is like building a blockchain is like building like a normal startup on like extra hard mode. Because it's not just about the tech, it's not just about the marketing, it's not just about the business. There's governance, there's community, there's a thing with real value that has to be considered, right, in the form of a cryptocurrency. And then you have to understand the economics of how that plays into the thing that you're building, right? So it's really multifaceted and multidisciplinary, which is probably why I love the space so much. And I think, frankly, to succeed in this space, you have to be a bit of a masochist and love pain, to be completely honest. And frankly, when we hire, that's something we filter for to some degree. But, I never got in the space to make money. I never got in the space to make, to make a name for myself. We just really wanted to build something that was useful and that would impact the world. And just the fact is, and the way that incentives are in the space, 90+% of most projects are really just here for money. But I think that's pretty normal for something that's, and when we talk about how I deal with it, well, I kind of take a step back and put it all into perspective, right? Because the invention of the corporation back in the 1600s, the amount of scams and grifters and everything from there on was just insane, right? And immense. The U.S. didn't get the SEC until the early 1930s, right? And it took, frankly, hundreds of years to even understand what a good business model was for a corporation, right? We are 15 years into this experiment from just Bitcoin, and now very quickly seeing Ethereum and now Solana, right? So for me, it's like it's almost the privilege of learning so that others don't have to deal with it later, and learning the different kinds of just ways to build something like this is just really important, and that helps at least keep me grounded with some of the difficulties, whether tokens up or token down, and outside of that, right? But honestly, it's hard and it's tiring, right? I mean, it can be very draining when especially when like me, you're online all the time. Sometimes you just want to shut off, and I'm from Florida and I live in Florida. Go to the beach, and just kind of just ignore it all. But ultimately, it's part of it, and I think it has its positives. It has its negatives.
Are you familiar with the tulip stocks in the Netherlands? This is around the invention of stocks in general.
Yeah, the tulip craze, yeah.
I feel like I struggle with, because I work in this space, so sometimes I feel, do we really need this stuff, right? And then I'd like to maybe talk about the positives about it eventually, but I think, do we need this? And when you're living in the West, you have a phone, you click 2 buttons, you smack it wherever you go, everything works. When you start going outside of this really well-established financial system, you'll see that moving money around between companies and countries is a very, very difficult task. It's very, very draining, and it isn't available everywhere. So that, to a certain degree, helps. But I wonder if we are currently in that tulip phase with this technology, or if there's like really truly enough value to justify all of the stuff that's happening within it. I think you might have a much better, opinion on that than I do. But I want to talk to you a bit about the 2021 to 2022 period of the Pocket network, the company, and the performance of the token and the value of the company, and how you dealt with that, how that felt to you. It's something that's like very close to my heart, and I think ties into a lot of the struggles that I've experienced. A lot of people in crypto have as well.
Yeah. Just to touch on your first point, when you were referring to the tulip phase, I mean, tulips were literally tulips and not able to be used for anything. Right? I don't recall if there was like a representation of them in terms of the stock market at the time in the Netherlands, but either way, the important part about being able to distribute stock was you were able to capitalize a company and be able to build things that were meaningful and material for the world, right? And I think blockchains are similar, just a different form of coordination for people. I think, just to touch one more bit on it before I get to the 21-22 phase, I think I think the systems that in the jurisdictions that we live in make a big difference here, and the incentives as well. I think if, for example, from at least a U.S. perspective, if our regulatory environment was nicer, we would actually have more people focused on building real things with real value. Instead, we're starting to see a bifurcation of those with the opportunity to invest before a token goes public, and those that have to wait until after it goes public. And we're seeing the public stock markets. We've seen the public stock markets in a similar scenario where companies just don't go public until they're worth billions and billions of dollars, removing the opportunity for those who are not, on the inside, right? And since, post ICO phase, which actually was a fair way to distribute a token and find a market value, we've seen something similar happen in the last 2 to 4 years where, investors get in at under 50 million valuation for a token. It launches at a 3 to 10 to 20x, and it's just easy money. And that's unfortunate. So I think it's very much the system and the incentives as well. It's also just easier to just copy pasta some DeFi protocol, tweak it, and get some TVL and then rug everyone as well. And I think that's just kind of the double-edged sword of building an open source and the nature of what we're building. And that just makes it easier. I think about like the 90s and the internet, and like, you had, all these big, people, all the people who are like the conglomerates today, whether that's Amazon or Google or Microsoft or Apple or whatever. But what was interesting about back then is that like they had to either figure it out themselves or die. And that, I think, creates a forcing function for really the best to figure it out and to really innovate and create new things. I think one of the downsides of kind of the open source world that we live in is that I think the incentives are set that like it's harder to innovate, it's easier to iterate and actually create something new. And that's, part of it as well, right? And that's not to say that people aren't innovating and that sort of thing, but I would say the talent pool is more spread out and less concentrated in fewer companies, because it's so easy for someone to go and build something if they have a slight iteration on an idea and they're able to market it or get out to market. So anyways, those are just my general thoughts on kind of the space, but talking about 2021 and 2022 and the growth of Pocket and the token and everything, I think there's a couple important points here, right? We launched, we had about 3 months of runway when we launched Pocket. Initially, we had raised about $1.9 million in July of 2020. And we just bet that it that would work and that we could hopefully raise money later, just by proving that it would work. Turns out that was a lucky bet because it did work. I'll bet like not well. Like no one's going to wait 3 seconds to 5 seconds for their data on their wallet to load, for example. But we were hustling. Like we went and integrated our endpoints in every single open source project that we possibly could. So like my Ether wallet, at the time, which is now my crypto, Portis, just every single open source product just to get some traffic to the network. And some people were cool to try it out, and that was great. And that gave us at least enough data and traffic to like improve the service. And you get kind of the flywheel of getting one person to use it. It sucks and it's crappy, but we like, okay, if they're waiting 5 seconds, let's bring it down to 3 seconds. Right, okay, now 2 seconds and 1 second, right? So really that first year up until summer 2021 was really spent, we had a few chain halts that I mentioned before, was really spent just fixing things and getting the service down to something at least like palatable for a developer to use. And that summer in 21, we got it down to about 500 milliseconds consistently, which, while not good, was good enough given the landscape at the time. Because at the time there was like, you could almost count on your two hands how many RPC companies that were out there. And, they were all supporting, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Matic at the time, now Polygon, right? And a few others. And we were seeing so many blockchains start to launch, and none of them were really being served. So that summer, once we got to that level, we made two really important decisions. We made the decision to, one, subsidize all the traffic by staking our POCT from a company perspective, and two, add as many blockchains as we possibly could, because we felt that they were being underserved. And around this time, this was like June, July 2021, we were doing about 5 to 10 million requests a day after being live for a year, which isn't very much. And then after that decision, we started to grow and grow and grow. And by the way, to talk about the token for a minute, at the time we weren't on any exchanges. The token had been live for a year. We were just on a couple Telegram OTCs. One of our investors had found someone that was reputable. He had been managing it. We actually had a couple people come into the community and build like a Telegram bot that ended up being an OTC, and a few others popped up. So the only way you could buy POCT was through Telegram, and basically a middleman that would take like 5% on the trade or something like that. And this was actually really interesting of a filter for community. Because you had to do your research and like jump through some hoops to even participate in the network. So the early people who, and this wasn't like intentional, but in hindsight was something that like was actually very beneficial for us as a protocol and as a community. The folks that jumped through those hoops and saw like what I was speaking about, what we were building, what we were trying to do, and kind of took the leap of faith. Still to this day are like some of our core community members and most active folks. But they were buying POCT at, I don't know, 10 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents, something like that. And as we started to grow in traffic, and this is like in the context of a ZERP environment, 0 interest rates, like free money, everyone's got their COVID checks, like this is like peak, like free money, right? So I think the macro really impacted us as well, in this respect. We just started to see like, traffic would go up another 20 million. You start to see the price chunk up like another 10 cents, 20 cents, which compounded how much money the node runners were making because of the way Pocket's economics work. We have a dynamic inflation model. So for every request that gets sent, Pocket is minted. So as traffic goes up, inflation is also going up massively. But we only have one like venue really, or a couple of venues where people can buy and sell. So it was a very concentrated liquidity, let's call it, right? Where people were buying and selling, and there was not enough POCT to sell because the node runners were like not wanting to sell it because supply and demand, right? So we started to just and this was 2021, and by November October, actually, we were doing. We that summer we had hit a goal. We said let's hit 100 million requests by end of year, daily requests. By October, we had an offsite, and I remember this because it was around the Day of the Dead in Mexico. We were doing 300 million requests a day, and inflation's going up. We have traffic spiking. That was really cool. We had a moment. We had kind of like a cool moment where there was a game called DeFi Kingdoms at the time that was just exploding on a blockchain called Harmony at the time. And the Harmony RPC had broken, and just DeFi Kingdoms alone had driven us from like 50 million to 200 million requests a day, and we like saved them. Like we saved the Harmony team. We were so close with them. They were like, "Oh man, you guys are great," and we're like, "Yeah, you guys are great." And it was like a love fest, right? Because token prices going up, markets are going up. It's DeFi summer. Everyone's like, "Oh, this is fucking great." That gets us to the end of the year where we're hitting 300, 400, 500, requests a day. The token's probably like $1. We're nearing like 1 billion FDV for the network. And then, that whole time I'm just like, we have to get listed on exchanges. We have to go do this. We have to go do that. And I kind of let myself get taken by the wave, by the cycle, by the excitement, by all the things. And, I'll never forget, we had a meetup, that was coordinated by someone else in the community in January 22, that's where we peaked in price. And I just remember, this is in Miami, and I just remember a couple of our community members were just giving out pocket nodes, and these were like $15,000, $20,000 a pop, and I'm just like, it's making me feel so shitty. Like, it's just like, we are so overvalued right now. This is just like, it made me cringe. It just made me not want to be there at that meetup, actually. I'll never forget that. Shortly thereafter we got listed. Throughout that time too, the DAO is like, we're all kind of freaking out because inflation is like 300%, and climbing. And we're like, we have to put in some inflation controls here. This took like 4 months to actually get passed. And then kind of the party ended once we started to reduce inflation. Hindsight's 2020. We could have done things differently in terms of how that happened, but ultimately, like, we felt the entire rush of the up. And then I'd say, throughout the next year and a half, 2 years, from 22 to maybe mid last year to even end of 23. And into 2024, like, it's just been dealing with the kind of other side of that, which, when you have thousands of token holders, hundreds of investors, token price peaks at $3 and is down 99%. You have people questioning the confidence. You have people questioning the team. It gets divisive. It gets, nasty on the internet. And here, we are just trying to just build the best thing we can. And obviously, I made a ton of mistakes. I think probably the biggest mistake I made in getting caught up with everything was we have to grow the team. And we went from that offsite during the Day of the Dead in Mexico, we were about 20 people. We grew to almost 80 people within the next year. And that was probably, out of all the mistakes that I made, probably the worst one that I made. Because I think one of the things that was special about the company at the time was the culture. And when you grow that quickly, you hire that many people, it's basically impossible to keep because it becomes a different beast. In a world where technology is deflationary and people should be getting more efficient, we got less efficient. We ended up spending more money than we needed to, didn't. Despite me having read every fucking book about the internet bubble, 2008, so many podcasts from investors that have talked about their experience, like I still got caught by it. And wasn't as conservative as I should have been. And we've been really recovering since then. And finally, like this year has been really the most stable year we've had since we really launched the network. Back when, from that first year we had, trying to fix things because, up then it was just a really fast rise down and a fast rise up and a fast rise down. And there's just, it's emotionally taxing. I went through a divorce, only recently wrapped that up. Right. And it's just, a lot, professionally and personally to have to deal with. Right. Thankfully, a somewhat consistent person who meditates, try to always be present. But it is tiring. I mean, so much so that last year I was pretty burnt out. Like it was, I was still going to conferences. I was still raising money. We, at one point we had, 3 months of runway and we managed to cobble together $8 million to fund the company and keep things going. And now we're good. But, doing all that while you're truly tired and burnt out is pretty taxing. So it's been a long process in kind of just, rediscovering, I think, the direction and the mission. Not really the mission. Probably not the mission, but just after all the chaos, it's like finally finding like the right path, if you will, and really having confidence in knowing the direction that we need to go in.
I want to linger a bit on the upside because, logically speaking, when you're in a normal period of your life, it's easy to say that you have the knowledge and the know-how to avoid getting caught up in your feelings and getting caught up in the chaos. But the reality, when you open your phone and you see these numbers and they're just like going up and going down, I don't think the average person understands what that does to your brain, because that is ultimately food and status and women and everything that the human is designed for. Just going up all day, every day. It is a lot on your brain, and it is a sort of drug. It's like falling in love, I think. I had a similar experience. I bought something, and within 6 days it went to $1 million, and it just broke my brain. And for about 3 months afterwards, I was having a real hard time shifting my focus from looking and trading into actually doing what I want to do, which is I want to work, I want to be a family person, I have a kid, there's a lot of things that I need to be doing, but instead my mind is occupied. And it took a while for me to get back down to reality and to realize it's just numbers on a screen. Do you feel like you're still living with the consequences of that? Have you been able to overcome it? How are you dealing with it, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, at one point I looked on paper and I'm worth like 9 figures, right? I think we never built Pocket for the money or started working on this for money. I'm less impacted personally by the numbers themselves, in the sense of having a nicer or worse life, like that stuff. I'm less personally, I think, concerned about or affected by. I'm someone who can adapt fairly quickly. Growing up, going to the DR in the summers and taking a shower with what we call a cubito and just the lights going out and I'm honestly I could adapt, I feel, to anything, but it's still nice. I think you said it really nicely. All of a sudden you have more attention. The numbers themselves, I just kind of got numb to them at some point. I think what tricked me the most was thinking that not understanding that it would end, that it would go down. No, even though I told you about where I was at this meetup, this is massively overvalued, and this what we've built does not reflect the value of what of the thing that it is today. And I think what comes from that is I hope wisdom, where in the future, we can be more conservative and when times are good, make sure that everything is properly capitalized and so on and so forth. But I try not to dwell too much, personally. I think about like just how incredibly exciting it was, and everyone loves you, and I'm someone who's very like I guess giving, in the sense of like I just want to see everyone be happy, right? Many times to the detriment of myself, but ultimately, like, um, the main side effects or the main consequences have been really from the impact to the network and the community and the company from that time, and me not having the foresight to prepare for the inevitable downturn. Even if I thought it would go down, I didn't think it would go down this much. Firstly, because I was like, we're building something real. Like, we have real traffic, we have real users, right? But we didn't have a real business. This was all free, subsidized by the token. Most of the people were on the cloud at the time. It was very expensive to operate the network, and just didn't have the foresight to kind of more properly prepare for that sort of thing. It's more, energy up, energy now down is draining regardless. So it's more getting my own personal like energy levels up after 2.5 years of just a quick up and a quick down, right? It's less of a mental, again, I don't think about the money. I don't really care about the money, to be honest. Obviously, like, the idea to be able to take a trip or buy dinner without having to think about it is a really nice luxury. But ultimately, like, what I care most about is just making sure this thing survives. And you kind of get fooled into, wow, we're invincible. We built this new thing that no one had done before. And that's just not always the case. I let myself get fooled.
I hope you don't take it as I'm dwelling too much on your like failures or the things that you've done wrong, but I think this is where most people can learn from, because you have to lose a lot to get these lessons. And even though you've spoken about reading the books and listening to the podcast, I'm sure that there is a reason that you managed, and your company managed to survive to this point, despite all of the things that have happened. There's one more thing I want to talk about and then move on maybe to some of the positives, which is you talk about like the growth of your company and the employee count and how that changed the culture. These people ultimately view you as the leader of the organization, and you made a lot of steps, I think, to let go of power and control in a lot of ways. And this is mainly what motivated me to have this conversation with you. The formation of a DAO structure, the foundation, moving on to the more technical side with Grove, and letting other people control what is your brainchild, essentially. Could you talk a bit about how you've been feeling about people and employing people in leadership over the last few years?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I can tell you, like, firing, where you're almost 80, and Grove is now 10 people, right? Every single one of those people is really hard, and that's also very draining, but regardless, yeah, I mean, we designed Pocket, and I did a talk at InfoCon in the Dominican Republic. It's a belief in the supranational, where it's really like, about blockchains being human coordination systems, and how they're internet native, and how we can really incentivize people for positive outcomes for the world, and this sort of thing. Part of that kind of head fake, or that time in 21 and 22, was like, okay, wow, like, we're big enough to, and this was always intentional from the day that we launched, because we actually launched the DAO about 2 or 3 months after we launched the protocol, and we kept wanting to get people to vote, and so on and so forth. And it was really cool to see how we designed the system, how we, from day one, frankly, gave up control, because ultimately the DAO governs 3 things in Pocket. It's the economics, basically kind of the Fed, right? Protocol upgrades, and the Treasury, the DAO Treasury. And, throughout those first couple of years, seeing people want to join the DAO and be really truly active in the ecosystem is really amazing. And we've gotten as high as about 60, a little bit over 60 DAO voters participating in the network. And the thing is, though, the more value you have to govern, the harder things get, and the more difficult it is for people to make big and hard decisions. And I think one of the head fakes that I had was, okay, like I can step down from the foundation, let the DAO kind of lead things and do things, because we were doing 1 billion, 2 billion requests a day. We were starting to what I believe were do the right things, and ultimately, we thought we were somewhere that we weren't, right, in terms of success and this sort of thing. And when you give up control and give up power, that's honestly a very hard thing to try to take back, especially when you think it's the right thing to do, because you're saying, hey, I know better, you don't, right? And that's a really hard thing to do, despite me never really knowing better. I just very lucky to be blessed with many people who are actually really brilliant around me, but ultimately, when you have a protocol that is worth, under, I think what 70, 80 million FDV today, at a peak of, 2 or 3 billion or whatever it was, you've got a DAO of 60 people, it's just a lot to coordinate around when, in a moment when you need to be able to move fast. So when I learn about people, just to answer your question, it's just more people, the harder it is, always. The more decision makers you have, the harder it is when you have a direct democracy like we have today, or had, we'll still have in Pocket, right? The bigger that DAO gets, the harder it is to make decisions. The more political it gets, the more people pick sides. And that's just not a fun place to be in when you're just trying to build something that, you're just really trying to push this forward, right? And ultimately, that led to me actually putting in a proposal, going through the DAO process, requiring a 75% quorum, which, by the way, is like not even the U.S. government requires a 65% quorum for the biggest decisions. It's actually 66%, which is incredibly difficult to get. Managed to pass it, literally like 2 hours before the end of the 2 weeks of voting. But we kind of re-centralized the governance of the protocol. The DAO can still vote me out, like that part is still there, but ultimately has some centralized decision making in favor of, or trading, what I'm kind of viewing it as, is trading for permissionless demand coming very soon. I think we're in a good spot because ultimately, while blockchains are trustless, they're also social. And if enough people don't agree with something, they can always fork it, right? And I think that's one of the best properties of blockchain. So if people don't agree with me, they're free to go and do what they will, right? But ultimately, like, to answer your question, growing a company at 80 people, it's really difficult. It takes time. Frankly, it takes experience. Wish I had some more people around me to help guide me at the time. Frankly, been doing, most of this just learning on the fly. Obviously, I've read every book, every management book, all the legends, right? From Intel to, Sony, all these people who are just legends, but it's just very different when you're actually in it. It's difficult to stay circumspect. It's and these sorts of things, but at the same time, you make the hard decisions because, despite what position people might be in personally, nothing else matters more than the success of the thing that you're building. Nothing else matters to me, and that's what's kind of enabled me to make the hard decisions that have had to be made and deal with whatever it is that has had to been dealt with.
One of the goals of my podcast is to understand leadership and to hear these great stories, because they are ultimately great stories. It takes a lot of effort and energy in human life to build something especially something important, to sustain it. And I think the common thread here that I've noticed is that there is no right decision when you're a leader. To the rest of the team, there's always something wrong. There's always a group of people that are going to think what you're doing is wrong. It just opposes their personal interests, and having the willpower to assert your knowledge and expertise is important, because you have to decide on a direction, and the person that thought of the idea, or the people that thought of the idea, are the ones that know the best path forward. I don't think you can outsource that. Like, the decision making and the path finding it's just not something you can outsource. So, to go to some of the positives.
Well, real quick on that. I actually disagree. You said something there. The people who created it know the best path forward. I actually don't agree with that. It's actually, I don't know the best path forward. I might have ideas of what the best path forward, but the important part is getting agreement on what the outcome is, and then from first principles, understanding what gets you there. Because honestly, most of the ideas or hard decisions or whoever did not come from me or my co-founders. It's come from everyone around me. And the important part is taking a ton of information and synthesizing it. And ultimately the accountability and the decision falling on you. But it is not that I have the best ideas, because in fact, and I'm really proud of this in terms of anyone I've ever worked with. It's like, people are like, Mike, that's a fucking stupid idea. And that's the case most of the time. And sometimes, the ideas just get refined or shifted or whatever. Right. And that's just based on feedback. I'm like, that makes way more sense. It's the same direction, but let's do it this way. Or, once we've decided to go that direction, we've got this other new information. Let's incorporate that. Right. Ultimately, there's no ego here. When it comes to building something, it's really about truly understanding what the outcome is, not having emotions or bias about it, and really making decisions based on first principles, whether the ideas come from me or anyone else in my orbit.
Do you think the average person you're working with, or the people that are closest to you, truly understand your vision? Or
Yes.
Do you think they all have a slightly different version of it?
No, I think everyone who's working with me, absolutely. Nothing getting alignment on that is so incredibly important, because otherwise you're not going to have an efficient or good working environment, nor will, if they don't agree with my vision, right, or the original vision of me and myself and my co-founders, they shouldn't be there, right? It might take time to understand it, but if you disagree, you shouldn't be here, honestly, because then I can't trust you to go and do what we hired you to do, or whatever it is, right? Because at that point, it's just if I don't believe that you are actually doing this for, X, Y, or Z reason, right? Where we think Pocket can be literally the foundation of all open source data, and literally the transport layer for the open internet, right? It's literally I've said TCP/IP for years. I really think Pocket is that's really what Pocket is, right? And if someone has a different idea for that, great. It's open source. Go build it yourself. But people quibble on. We quibble on strategy and what's important, right? And why that's important. Whether it's do we migrate from AWS to GCP, or do we build an RPC business, or do we build something that enables other gateways, right? Every decision that we've made has been the right decision, based from first principles, from the goals that we're trying to reach, right? Every single time. And sometimes they were the wrong decision, sometimes they were the right decisions, but ultimately, you can make 1,000 wrong decisions and one right decision, and it makes up for all of it as well. So, and that's just generally how I think about things and leadership and stuff like that.
So I have a few questions around how you're handling things positively, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you for doing this. I've learned a lot so far. You said, first you're from Jamaica. You have roots in
Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic?
Okay. It's okay.
They're very close, right?
Yes, okay. It's in the Caribbean.
Yeah, the American in me.
That's all good.
How do you feel like that affects your life and the way you think about business? Do you feel like it has an impact on you?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think culturally, you kind of see differences in terms of even how people work or how people give themselves up to a company or however it might be. What was it? I just saw Eric Schmidt speak. I think it was at Stanford. This was like a couple weeks ago. It was a video on YouTube. And he was like, this is a broad statement, but he was like, I don't like hiring Americans. They're entitled. They don't work as hard, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I wouldn't say that I don't like hiring Americans, but I would also say that like you kind of see a different drive or a different level of ambition from folks internationally. Generally, you kind of saw this kind of different tension even in the company to some degree because we were originally pretty Latino. We were like 90% Spanish speaking. Like I'm fluent in Spanish. Over my co-founders were and then we started to see kind of different cultures clash. And if you don't have things in the right, if the culture isn't strong enough, like the company culture, that's really hard to deal with. And I think just generally, this is from from a observation point at least, just like when you have a remote company and you just have different cultures, it's just something that it's beautiful, but it can also be difficult at the same time, right? Ultimately, it doesn't matter where you're from. There's really smart people. There's people who work really hard, no matter where. Like Americans as well. I think Eric Schmidt was generalizing there because, frankly, everyone we've hired has just worked incredibly hard. But you do see different priorities from people over time, and just being able to have something global really requires a really strong vision and a really strong culture to make it work, because otherwise it could very easily implode on itself. But frankly, being international has made it easy for me to connect with more international people. It's made it easy for me to connect and hire and these sorts of things. Helps me stay grounded, to be honest. In terms of the country I came from with my parents, my parents weren't wealthy. We were pretty middle class, right? So it's not like we came from anything crazy either. So being able to see that is just it's always been very, very grounding at the very least. And on the positive side, just being able to connect with people is just really nice. And also you see the dynamics of living in the US versus going to the DR, building the Pocket DAO and the governance and stuff like that. You see corruption on both sides for different reasons and different things. And you kind of think about that when you're designing, a governance system and these sorts of things. And that was all kind of somewhat contemplated, while not perfect. I thought was pretty successful for what it did.
You talked a lot about meditation through this, and that has been something that allowed you to keep your calm and get back to a positive state. How did you start getting into meditation, and what is the ritual around that, I guess?
Yeah, it's actually a funny story. I was selling back when I told you about that credit union I worked at. I was selling a credit card to this Asian man, and he had on a hat, and it was two ovals that were perpendicular, and it had a circle around it. And I'm just making conversation, trying to connect with them, and hey, so what's that hat mean? He was like, it's a man cross-legged meditating with his aura around it. And I had listen, I think it was Tim Ferriss or just random stuff people had mentioned meditation just offhand, but never took it seriously. And I was like, oh, really interesting. Tell me, how could I start to do that? And he's like, look, next time you lay down, just start at 11, and every breath in and out is one count. Work your way down to 0. And when you get to 0, go back up to 10. Work your way back down. Each breath is a count. And then all the way down to get down to 0. It took me 2 years to sit down and complete the whole practice, which is about a 45-minute practice. So to this day, like and then throughout that process, I actually went to this like Buddhist meditation temple in Tampa for like a summer on Sundays, and that was really cool because you'd sit down for 25 minutes. They do the gongs, then we do a 20-minute walking meditation, and then we sit down again for another 25, do the gongs, and we'd be silent, sweeping, cleaning for like, for like an hour after. So like I really got really deep into it for a long time, or for a couple of years, not a long time. Now it comes in and out, like, I find I use it when I need it, I feel like. But I do find myself like noticing when I'm not present, even if it's after the fact, it kind of helps me remind myself like, okay, be present, or that sort of thing, or help shut off like, if I'm angry at someone or sad or disappointed or whatever it is. And to this day, like I'll just wake up and, some days I'll do 5 minutes, some days I'll do 30. It just depends what I'm feeling like. But to this day, it's a muscle, right? It's literally a muscle, because it literally took 2 years to actually sit down for 45 minutes. And I've never gotten like, whatever, never felt like, oh wow, I'm feeling like almost like you're on drugs or something. Like I never felt like that feeling. Just always just felt calm and airy after I'm done, kind of a thing. So
yeah, it takes a lot to not think about other things.
Yeah, it does.
And you get lost pretty quickly. You have a goal, and then 30 seconds later,
yeah,
you're already thinking about, oh shit, I forgot to send that email.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried it for a while, and it did help. And at this point, I feel like my life has gone lost to this efficiency thing, where every minute needs to be taken advantage of, and I just don't think it's a healthy mindset. It has trade-offs. You've mentioned that you've read a lot from different writers, podcasts, all these people with wisdom. What advice have you found to be very applicable in your life?
That's a good question. I've always, I forget who said this or where I read it, but I've always loved and lived by like the reward for good work is more work. Generally, so that goes to responsibility and just anything. More broadly, one day I'm going to write a blog post about this, but I think more entrepreneurs should read like hardcore fantasy books. Actually, I think I've learned a lot about how to treat people, and I think build what I believe is just an incredible like group of people in business that I truly trust. And like when you read whether it's Harry Potter, Wheel of Time, Dungeons and Dragons, Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones as well. You've always got the protagonist that is like the honorable protagonist, and you've got like the paladins, and you've got the people, like there's always this concept of honor, and back from however long ago you even had some of that, although I would argue it didn't really exist, but at least in these fantasy books, this concept of honor, and I look back on it and reading these books where you have that same kind of hero's journey story, and ultimately, like I think we all believe that we're in our own hero's journey as well, which is why I think I identify so much with these books. And I've read, Robert Jordan or Brian Jacques or Ari Salvatore, probably my favorite. The whole Drizzt, like it's all the same story, but you kind of learn the lessons of like how to treat people. And I think in business, like I think when you treat people well and the right way, it doesn't always work out the way you hope, but I think ultimately I've created more long-lasting connections with people that are going to last me a lifetime, that will ultimately be good in business for me down the road, whether it's today or not, that it just has served me so well. So like, when I think about advice, I'd say just like, read some of these traditional fantasy books and see how the characters interact and how that impacts them to reach the kind of the final, whatever the final goal for them is.
I really like the concept of archetypes in Jung and how he breaks down like that whole side of like psychology. It's very woo, but also it makes a lot of sense. Like people have patterns, and we're all on our own journey, and we should all try to be the hero. Have you read Berserk?
I haven't.
I highly recommend it.
Okay.
I'm not the kind of person that likes, I don't know, like fantasy in general, or especially like the manga medium never really got to me. But because I'm here, I started reading it, and it is probably the best evolution of like a character that I've seen. At least it surpasses the medium it's in, which is something. Yeah, I like more like science type books and like just like programming and very very like not nice stuff to like just sit down and do for pleasure. Yuval Noah Harari, I feel is
Harari.
His work is really inspirational. Like he has such a great ability to zoom out and see things like on a much bigger time scale. I that helps, just that concept of zooming out. But thank you so much again for the time. Is there anything that you want to end this with?
Just feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk.
Yeah, I'll put links in the description, and yeah, I'm really excited to see where Pocket goes. I have no doubt that you're going to be around for a long time. It is the only thing that does what it does.
Yeah. Well, thank you, man.
Thank you so much.
This is fun. Thanks.